it was found by the Supreme Court of Appeal that chanting "kill the Boer, kill the farmer" is not hate speech. It was then taken on appeal to the Constitutional Court, who then ruled that they're not even going to hear it. Is this an accurate description, and what's your view on this?
Julius Malema provided an enormous amount of context during his testimony. This is a song that has a literal meaning. When I asked him to pledge that he would never call for the slaughter of white people, he refused.
The point is not to say that, from a legal perspective at least, that this is hate speech because that farmer was murdered as a result of Malema chanting the song at this event. You don't need to prove that. But what is concerning is that it is happening. So farmers are being attacked and killed while politicians are chanting about attacking and killing farmers.
You cannot have a situation where some groups are given full license and others, have to walk on eggshells all the time. That's not what our, legal framework envisages. It's a crazy thing to sort of blame AfriForum Solidarity for basically ringing the alarm bell and saying, hey, there's some serious problems here. I mean, firstly, if they were lying, it wouldn't be very hard to do a little bit of fact-checking. I mean, it's the American government, right?
Yes.
I think they can go and find out what your laws actually say. I think they can go and read your news reports. I think they can watch the videos that the ANC and the FF are putting out there.
Mark Oppenheimer, thank you for joining us. It's good to have you on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure.
So there's been a lot happening in the country over the last few weeks and months and years, you could say. And I'm very happy to speak with you because you are, as far as I am concerned, the leading expert, or at least one of the leading experts when it comes to topics of hate speech and free speech and so forth. And it's something that you've been working on a lot. And which, of course, is a very contemporary topic in South Africa. And I want to talk about that with you, and then we can get to sort of the bigger picture. But maybe the most important place to start is with this recent development with the Constitutional Court ruling, you could say, in favor of the kill the Boer, kill the farmer chant, in the sense that it was found by the Supreme Court of Appeal that chanting "kill the Boer, kill the farmer" is not hate speech. It was then taken on appeal to the Constitutional Court, who then ruled that they're not even going to hear it. Is this an accurate description, and what's your view on this?
Yeah, that is an accurate description. I got inundated with messages from colleagues expressing extreme concern that the Constitutional Court wasn't even willing to hear argument on the matter, especially given how important the matter is. It's, deals with really two fundamental rights in our Constitution, free speech on the one hand and dignity on the other. The Constitutional Court has a tendency to entertain these matters. So, for example, in the matter of Kwalani and Masuku, both of those matters went to the Constitutional Court. It seems as well that the decision reached by the Supreme Court of Appeal and also by the Equality Court is at odds with the decisions in Kwalani and Masuku. Mm-hmm. So it's very surprising that the Constitutional Court would take that stance. And I think a lot of people have always thought of that court as the last stop saloon, that no matter how bad things get in South Africa, our rights will always be protected by the Constitutional Court, that it's the sort of upper guardian of all South African citizens. And I think a lot of people suddenly thought, well, hold on a second, if certain groups don't get protection from that court, what does this mean? How much faith can we have in the court? How much trust can we have in the court? How alarmed should we be?
Yeah, and what's especially striking about this is we can talk about when is something hate speech and when should something be regarded as hate speech, because obviously free speech is very important. So one, we can look at the actual lyrics of. It's not really a song; it's more a chant. There are songs as well, but this one is just "kill the Boer, kill the farmer" being chanted, and the context at political rallies and so forth. But what makes this even worse is the testimony of Julius Malema when this was heard in the High Court. Tell us a bit about that. What was some of the things he said, and are you concerned that perhaps because of these things, the Constitutional Court should have taken this into account?
Yes, so part of what you've got to do when you're determining the meaning of the words of the chant, and the FF considered a chant as well, is to look at that context. And so Julius Malema provided an enormous amount of context during his testimony. So, firstly, he said, when I think of a word farmer, I think of a white person. He said that it is an instruction to Nyamazane, soldiers, to go out and to kill. He said, I am not afraid of killing. We're not afraid of dying. When the time is right, we will bomb the Union buildings. So all of that testimony gives an indication that this is a song that has a literal meaning. When I asked him to pledge that he would never call for the slaughter of white people, he refused. The judgment of the Quality Court says that the song is actually targeted at the incumbent ANC government for their failures in land reform. And I found this rather astonishing because it wasn't argued by anybody.
Yeah, it's literally not what he said. He literally said the opposite.
Yes.
Or at least he framed it differently. It was not. And I can just add that I remember in the Shoot the Boer case, the Dubula Ibunu case in 2010, 2011, Malema was then with the Youth League. It might have been when he was leaving the ANC with this friction. And what was striking was that the argument of the ANC was, we are chanting this not because of its contemporary use, but because we are commemorating the struggle that is past. So it's a song that reminds of our history. But this is particularly not what Julius Malema is saying. He's not chanting this because he's thinking back at the good old days of the struggle. He's chanting it because the struggle isn't over. And we still need to go out and, if necessary, use violence to engage in this struggle.
Yes, I mean, he says that violence is a necessary thing to decolonize, that it must be present in a revolution. The revolution is now. There's also a sense in which he's coupled that with moves to say we have to have expropriation or compensation, that we must take people's land. He's called for land invasions on multiple occasions, and in a race-based manner, that the whites are thieves. They came in 1652, they confiscated our land. I asked him, do you consider whites from 350 years ago and today as being the same group? He said, yes, they are the same group of people. They carry the sins of their fathers. So you have this race-based animus. And then, of course, a large portion of that trial was really about discussing farm murders, a topic that's become so terribly taboo in South Africa. The press sort of want to either minimize it or not talk about it. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that context. Part of how we ran the trial was to model it on the Kolani trial process, which is to give intimate testimony and then broader testimony. So, we had people who had survived farm attacks talk about what that was like, what it's like when they hear Kill the Boer, what sort of painful memories that triggers. We had someone who testified his wife was murdered in his bed and he was shot and paralyzed, and it sort of brings up those memories whenever he hears Kill the Boer. We then had a pastor testify about the counseling that he gives all those survivors and the impact it has on the communities. You, of course, gave incredible testimony about the actual numbers, what the ratios look like. You have a sort of line that, well, it's a small number, but when you look at your chances of being killed as a farmer versus being anyone else in South Africa, they're dramatically high. It's 100 out of 100,000. Whereas our murder rate is 33 out of 100,000, and our intruder attack rate is only 5 out of 100,000. And all farm attacks are necessarily intruder attacks by definition. So, one of the things about the matter, I suppose, and it being televised, was that it raised a lot of awareness about a very important issue. I think it made people recognize that there is a serious problem with farm attacks. It made people recognize that the FF are a dangerous hate group. In their own words, they are revolutionaries who are called killing machines. This is again testimony from Malema during the trial. So I think there's a sense in which it's been enormously useful for making insiders understand what we're dealing with, and outsiders. Much of that footage has now been picked up by Elon Musk and Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, and I think that's been useful for shining a light on what's happening here.
Yes. So let's talk about hate speech. I don't think we need to even explain why freedom of speech is important, because I think we agree that it's very important. So if freedom of speech is so important, what's the point of having something like hate speech? Should we not just say, or we can have the argument sort of from a contextual or a philosophical perspective, but then also what does the law say? So if there is such a thing as hate speech, where's that line between freedom of speech and hate speech?
I'll give you the legal answer first, which is that our Constitution provides these very robust protections for free speech. borrowing three categories. So propaganda for war, the incitement of imminent violence, and then advocacy of hatred on the grounds of race, gender, ethnicity, and religion, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm.
Yes.
So that last bit is the hate speech provision. It's now kind of encoded in our law in the Equality Act, which has gone through some revision because of the Kulani case. So hurtful speech, which used to be hate speech, is no longer. But the sort of simplest ones to understand are when you propagate hatred against the group and then you call on them to be harmed by a third party.
So there's a call to action.
There's
It's
a call to
identifying a group and then calling for action to be taken against them.
Yes, exactly. There's an alternative, which is that the speech itself is very harmful, and that's meant to be a higher standard than merely hurtful. But on the sort of harder test, the constitutional test, kill the Boer is about as like economical as you could get. You're saying this group of people who are Afrikaners deserve death, and you should go out and you should kill them. I mean, you couldn't say it in a shorter way.
Yeah.
And then you're chanting it at a mass rally with 90,000 people chanting along with you.
After making a speech saying all whites are criminals and they should be treated as such and all of that. Yes, yes.
And under situations where some of those brutal farm murders, there's a terrible case of a mother and a daughter who are murdered with smashed up bottles, and it's unclear whether the daughter has also been raped because of the way the bottles have attacked her, and Kill the Boer is written in blood over their bodies. One of the things that the trial court did, which was really disingenuous, and even the Supreme Court of Appeal agreed that it was wrong, was the idea that you have to prove a causal connection between the song and a real-world attacks. And a lot of the evidence that we led in that case was to provide context, to say these are things that are happening. This is not just in a vacuum. There are reasons to believe that the continuation of the song, could lead to violence, but there's no requirement on us to show that there's a link, which was, accepted by the Constitutional Court in Kulani. But the way that the High Court dealt with it is to say we're disqualifying all of your evidence on the basis that you couldn't prove a causal link.
Yeah.
Which, contradicts a very clear constitutional principle that was argued before the court, and the SCA didn't buy. The SCA sort of take a strange line on it, which is to say, well, any reasonable reader would just see this really as political rhetoric and wouldn't read it literally, which is odd given that you've got the political leader themselves telling you how literally they mean it with all the rest of the context. And you have a decision from the Constitutional Court that says there must be heightened scrutiny when it comes to political leaders. That's who hate speech law is meant to target. It's the person who's the demagogue standing in front of the crowd. You can exert influence over them. And what we found in South Africa is that it's precisely not that person who's held to account. It's people like Penny Sparrow, who's like a little old lady in the middle of nowhere who is a retired state agent. That person is like literally Hitler and must be destroyed. But the politicians who can actually do something, who can encourage the crowd to go and perform real world violence, well, with them, we shouldn't take it literally.
Yeah. And so one of the remarkable things about the discussion on farmer killings is that there are many crime phenomena in South Africa. But when you talk about farm killings, the response, at least from the establishment, you could say, is that why are you talking about this particular crime phenomenon and not that one? When there are campaigns to stop gender-based violence, there are campaigns to stop rhino poaching, there are campaigns, for copper cable theft, and you can go down the list. There's a long list of unique crime phenomena with regard to which there are campaigns to have this stopped. And none of these are responded to with accusations of mala fides, like, why are you concerned about this? But when it comes to farm murders, you always get that. And the other thing with farm murders that is unique is the extent to which this is romanticized by politicians. You don't have politicians talking about how we should go out and poach rhinos. Gender-based violence, we've had some examples of politicians saying disparaging things about women and so forth, but not really saying, chanting about beating women and so forth. But when it comes to the farm killings, this is what's happening. And so it's in a sense a very unique problem. And it links to the hate speech because, as you said, the point is not to say that, from a legal perspective at least, that this is hate speech because that farmer was murdered as a result of Malema chanting the song at this event. You don't need to prove that. But what is concerning is that it is happening. So farmers are being attacked and killed while politicians are chanting about attacking and killing farmers.
I mean, just to give you the corollary, so the Kulani case, John Kulani was a anti-apartheid journalist and quite a religious Catholic. And just after gay marriage was legalized, he wrote an article. The headline was "Call me names, but don't call me gay." And the passage that he got in trouble for was as follows. So he said, "I pray that politicians would have the balls to change those parts of the Constitution that allow a man to marry a man and ditto a woman, because one day some idiot may demand the right to marry an animal." And there was a cartoon of a priest performing a wedding, and there's a guy marrying a goat, and it says, "I now pronounce you man and goat." Now, Kulani didn't do the headline, didn't do the cartoon. The evidence that was led was there's no causal link between the article and any violence against the gay community, but the gay community is a vulnerable community that has had a history of being attacked. They'd led evidence of people who were, so lesbian women in the townships who talked about how that kind of article exacerbates tensions, makes it easier for it to be targeted. She said, I don't know if anybody who ever attacked me read the article, but I'm telling you that we're in a tense situation. And then you had the sort of, broader evidence about, the discrimination that the gay community had experienced. And what you have is that the Constitutional Court says that amounts to hate speech. Now, what's interesting about that is that Kulani doesn't mention gay people at all in it, that he's targeting the institution of gay marriage.
Yes.
And nonetheless, the court was willing to read it in a manner that said, well, we're concerned about the effects this might have on vulnerable members of South Africa, and so therefore we're going to make a hate speech finding. They did this even after he had died. So it's interesting then when you look at that kind of speech, and then you look at something which is so much more overt in Kill the Boer, and a complete refusal to even entertain arguments from the Constitutional Court. Though I think the earlier question you asked was a sort of philosophical one about should we have hate speech laws at all. And the danger with hate speech laws is that they wind up assisting some groups and not others. And the sort of history of them is that minority groups in particular, they're often used to persecute them, and they aren't given the protection that the law says it will, even if it's drafted in this sort of neutral manner. And I think that's what we've seen play out in South Africa, that the golden thread that can be worked out with our hate speech cases, instead of looking at principles, instead of trying to sort of do the assessment that the courts tell you to do, you should basically just look, what's the race of the speaker? What's the race of the group that's being targeted? That's your answer. And once you're in that sort of system of law, you've basically abandoned a legal project. You've abandoned the rule of law. You've abandoned non-racialism. You've abandoned equality. It's one of the reasons why in the Supreme Court of Appeal, the Rule of Law Project, who I acted for, intervened and said we need to be able to talk about this double standard problem, that you cannot have a situation where some groups are given full license and others, have to walk on eggshells all the time. That's not what our, legal framework envisages. Interesting enough, there's one exception. So there's a case I ran against Valapi Kumalo. So Kumalo had said we should do to white people what Hitler did to the Jews. They should be burnt alive, hacked to death, and their children turned into garden fertilizer. And so the Human Rights Commission brought a complaint. I acted for them in it. And Judge Sutherland, who wrote the judgment for the Equality Court, said you cannot have different rules for different races.
Yes.
That whether you are an ascendant group or a minority group or a powerless group or a powerful group, the law applies to you equally. And you cannot have a sense in which some people are given greater protections than others. And that sort of line of thinking has been picked up in some directions, but it seems to have been roundly ignored in the Kill the Boer case.
And this goes to that Human Rights Commission finding in 2019, which was very, very alarming, in which it basically said that the ruling by the Human Rights Commission saying that you need to consider the race of the person that is being accused in determining whether it's hate speech or not. Can you tell us a bit about that? Yeah,
very alarming. I mean, what's interesting is that there's a international law principle about this things you must take into account. It's called the rebut principles of action. And you're supposed to take into account the sort of overall environment in which the speech happens, the status of the speaker, the likelihood of harm, those sorts of things. Now, status of the speaker doesn't mean the race of the speaker. It means, is this person prominent or not? Are they some nobody, or are they someone who's got like a massive megaphone? And the way that it's been misinterpreted by the Human Rights Commission is to say, well, no, the race of the speaker is the bit that does the work. And what that does is sort of, in a shocking way, treats all people of the same race group as if they're identical to each other, as if you could just swap them out, that all black people are interchangeable with each other as are all white people. It seems to me that there's a big difference between someone like Julius Malema or Cyril Ramaphosa, who have enormous influence, enormous political power, enormous wealth, and to say we should treat them as if they were a vulnerable poor person, who lives in Kwakwa.
Yeah.
Like
That's the logic, yeah.
yeah, that's the logic, and it's a wild thing to do, and to sort of assume that all white people are identical with each other, that they don't come from different parts of the world, worship different gods. Even the clustering them as a group is rather sort of sinister to my mind.
Yeah.
And then to assume that they're all white monopoly capitalists, who are, enjoying their trust funds and don't have a care in the world, also doesn't take into account that you have huge stratifications within that group in terms of political power, access to jobs. There are almost no white people in government, and there haven't been for a long time. You're dealing with a group that is often heavily marginalized systemically. A lot of people are skeptical about the idea of systemic racism. If you think systemic racism is when you create a structure which has the effect of marginalizing a certain group, well, that's what we've done in the modern South Africa.
Yeah.
We have 142 race-based laws, many of which make it very difficult for people to, get a job or start a business on the grounds of their race. That seems to be race-based marginalization writ large. And of course, talking about that would make you a white supremacist.
Yeah. It's really strange the extent to which these double standards are being applied. And what is also alarming is it's not just we're talking about this court ruling now, but it's also a phenomenon in the media. And I remember we spoke about this during the trial, and it's something that I wrote about in the book, the Kill the Boer book, where just looking at how the media responds to incidents of violence on a farm, where the most important variable is the race of the perpetrator. That the race of the perpetrator determines how the media responds to it, and it's very alarming. But I do what is I think remarkable about this is it's almost always the most senior people in the media, in my experience at least, and I made a post on X about this recently, is that if you speak with younger, more junior journalists, my experience at least, is they are sort of more open to different opinions and so forth. But it's the media establishment largely who have these very strong views or this very strong narrative that they are trying to push.
Yes, it very much feels that way, that the sort of press bias on this issue is just gigantic. And I sort of wonder why. There's a sense in which I think journalists are a little bit like high school girls, and they're just looking for what the next cool, fashionable thing is. A good friend of mine refers to them as fashion victims. And so they sort of read the tea leaves of Twitter, at least before Musk took it over, and sort of go like, well, we need to, go with these kind of cool topics, and these other things are untouchable and not cool, so we're not going to go with them. And they've done the same with various figures. I mean, the press has been very enamored with the EFF over the years. They would breathlessly go and interview Julius because he was on some new diet or something.
Yeah, I remember that.
And there's a sense in which they want to show that they're the good whites. I think there's a fair chunk of that going on, that a lot of the cheerleaders, want to say, I'm not like the other whites. I'm not one of the bad, evil ones. And so you can trust me because I'm going to sort of like actively take digs and, claim that there's white victimhood when you have all these race-based laws, and how dare you complain, given what you people did. Not me, of course. I'm one of the good ones.
Yes.
So I think that explains some of it. I also just think they are a little bit like a flock of birds, so that there's not like a massive grand conspiracy. They're just sort of looking left and right and sort of seeing what their colleagues do and floats in that direction. There's often a sense in which newsrooms just don't have the money they used to have. So you've got this heavy juniorization. You've got a lot of pressure on them to publish because there's now a 24-hour news cycle for print, for digital, basically. And so that means that when you get a press release from someone, you basically just republish it as if it's your article, because it takes work off your shoulders. And if you go and look at Muckrack and you look at certain journalists and how many articles they've published, it's junior people who've been there for a very short period of time will have published like 1,000 articles.
Yeah.
And you go, they can't be substantive articles because they're not. I was at a talk last night by a quite prominent editor at News 24, who said that in his publication, it's quite often the case that you just have people, taking the ANC line on things, that whatever the press release that comes out of the Tilly House is, they just rubber stamp it and stick a name on it. And he said particularly so with younger younger journalists.
Yeah. Well, I've sort of joked about this in the past as someone who has issued many press statements that I've actually written many news reports, because you can see that if you issue a press statement and a publication just takes that statement and publishes it as if it is the news report. But there's something else about this that I've noticed, and that is the shallowness, you could say, among many of these people who are so very outspoken in terms of the virtue signaling and so forth, that I know it has become a bit of a trope, this debate me thing on X and social media, people challenging others to debate. But a lot of these people, editors and so forth, who are so you could say malicious or take these very hard lines on issues, when you have an actual conversation with them, or they are put in a position where there's a more informal conversation and there's a disagreement, you find out that they're actually not very well read on the topic that they are so well, that they have such strong views on. And so maybe that's part of, I think this is not the main focus of our conversation, but it goes to this point of the media losing credibility. And I guess there's a lot of reasons for that. One of it is just new technology. But another one is the extent to which, and this goes to the Kill the Boer case, the extent to which journalists and editors who are supposed to be neutral, or at least attempt to be neutral, have become active role players in this debate.
Yeah, this editor last night described some of his colleagues as seeing their role as activists within the organization, that they see themselves as part of the political sphere as opposed to merely reporting on it.
Was he concerned about this, or did he just say that that's how they see things?
No, I think he was concerned about it. Oh. The only reason I'm not naming him is that we had a Chatham House Rules
Yes.
at the event last night. But yeah, there's a sense in which I think you can see the dangers of a weakened press, of a press that's sort of losing readership gigantically. If I sort of look at how many publications in the print media that have closed down, the explosion of the online space, and I think a hunger for people to actually have considered conversations that have some depth to them. I mean, the greatest example I can think of journalists having to be held to account was Helen Zille's Tea with Helen series that she did, where she basically just obliterated the journalists that had been writing about over the years. I think one of them started with just, "I'm so terribly sorry." That they know that that they. I think the nature of journalism is such is that you're kind of, in some senses here, at least for the short form stuff, you're feeding gossip around. If you think about, the coverage over the GNU and the budget, basically you've just got warring press statements coming out of the parties that the press just, redistributes. There's no analysis. There's no long form thinking. There's a huge lack of depth that if you sit down with any of these guys and you say, let's have an hour-long discussion about this and see how much you know. Firstly, I think very few of them would ever do it because they know they'd get obliterated because there isn't the depth. You contrast that with a journalist like Mara-Louise Antoni,
Yes.
who's willing to put in enormous amounts of work, months of research, read everything, and then write a long form article. You sort of look at her coverage over the Volkanov saga at Stellenbosch, and how it just completely dismantles that News 24 project, where you had 64 propaganda pieces that were just churned out, making crazy allegations that Volkanov was, overrun by Nazis and rape and KKK. All of it completely debunked, but the propagandists did a good job there, because you basically repeat the big lie over and over and over again, and people go, oh, there must be something there, and it turns out nothing there. So, there's a sense in which people then get sick of the mainstream journalism and they start to look at, long-form content where people actually do the research, where they're an expert in their field, and they can find out more. And that's why we've had this explosion in the YouTube space and the podcast space in South Africa and abroad. Yeah.
And so I want to hear your views on the Trump administration. And they've really, in a certain sense, shattered this wall about what's happening in South Africa, because it's always been this thing that you're not allowed to talk about, say negative things about what's happening in South Africa. And then Trump came out and did the exact opposite, as one could have predicted in a certain sense. So I'd love to hear your views on that, and also the accusations now that this is because of people spreading misinformation. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so one of the questions that I raised with the editor last night was to say, why did News 24 set up a special misinformation desk that sort of has a Soviet-style ring to it that has specifically gone after organizations like Solidarity and AfriForum? And that when it comes to actual fact-checking, there isn't much fact-checking going on. There's basically a sense of, we don't like this. I mean, a good example is Martin van Staden, who's at the Free Market Foundation, produced this index of race laws, 142 race laws. So you'll have people saying, we're fact-checking this, and it's all a lie. And then they'll say, well, there are the race laws, but the race laws are very good. So it's sort of like a denial project, but also it's actually okay. Yeah. When you sort of look at the allegations that were raised against from Solidarity for going out there and saying this is a big misinformation project, there was no analysis as to, okay, what are they saying? Why is that stuff inaccurate? If it's misinformation, point out what it is.
Where is the lie? Yes.
Where is the lie? And it's quite evident if you go and read that Washington memorandum that the issues that are identified are serious issues. So you've got the Expropriation Act signed into law that allows for land to be expropriated with nil compensation. And they give 4 examples of it, but it's not a closed list. You have a legal regime that discriminates against people in very many sectors on the grounds of their race, that it's very difficult if you're white to get admitted into various professions. For example, at the bar in Johannesburg, they admit 100 pupils every year. I think this year they have accepted 2 white people in prior years it was 0. So that just strikes me as like massively racist discriminatory. It's not just white people that get discriminated against. If you're colored or Indian, the idea is we need to cap your numbers to your proportions. So Indian people make up 2% of South Africa, so only allowed 2 of you people in here. That sort of thing just strikes me as like really disgusting and reminds me of the sort of dark days of apartheid, and we're doing it again, but this time it's justified, it's good.
Yeah.
I'm
now
sure
it's us doing it, so now it's a good idea. Yeah.
So the Trump regime picks up on that, and I think James Myburgh puts it very well. He says the ANC are very used to speaking on 2 different radio frequencies. Then on the first channel you say all the radical stuff, like white people are land thieves, they are deserving of punishment, that we should take their property, we should exclude them from the economy, that they're too powerful. And then channel 2 is we're a liberal democracy, we believe in non-racialism and equality before the law. And so Channel 2 has been sort of expressed abroad, and most people said, oh yeah, South Africa is this wonderful success story. We stopped sort of tuning in 30 years ago after Mandela ended the fairy tale story, and we assume everything's fine. And now you have the Trump regime going, hold on, Channel 1, that sounds kind of interesting. Like, I'm a little bit worried about some of that stuff. Yeah. And so things like Julius Malema singing Kill the Boer, things like Cyril Ramaphosa saying, Trump can keep his America and we'll keep our South Africa, sounds very similar to the kind of things that Rob Mugabe said about the UK, or that P.W. Boer would have said during the Rubicon speech. This sort of like just leave us to our race nationalist project, so we can sort of obliterate these minority groups in peace. And the Trump regime saying, well, if you want to do that, then don't expect any help. We're going to introduce tariffs have sort of just come in at 30% against South Africa. You've got USAID taken off wholesale, but then you have things like the National Institute of Health in America. And the University of Cape Town, of which I'm a council member of, is the greatest beneficiary of NIH funding outside of America. So they got a 2 billion rand grant from America, about 600 million of which is sort of there for this year. And the Americans have said, UCT's particular stance, it's hostility towards Israel, it's hostility towards America, its research collaborationships with Iran, Russia, and China are antithetical to that project continuing. And you have a choice, which is that you can either play ball, respect academic freedom by withdrawing your boycott against Israeli academics, or we're going to pull the money and you're going to lose, I think they estimate between 200 and 400 jobs in the health sector, and another 200 million rands worth of ongoing damage from that, plus donors withdrawing their funds. And you have UCT very narrowly deciding to spit in the face of America in a vote that was 13-14. The council sort of decided, you know what, keep your money. We don't care if we implode. We don't really care if we're the top university in Africa anymore. We'll just plunge through the rankings. And that sort of situation is just like terrible to watch unravel. And one hopes that South Africa doesn't make that sort of same mistake on a macro level. Because really, if you think about the reforms that Solidarity Movement have asked for and that the Trump regime has identified, they would be wonderful for all South Africans. Really make it a place of non-racialism.
Yes.
Stop threatening people's property rights. Stop, discriminating on a whole bunch of bases. You could have a wonderful country. And there's a sort of tragic thing about it is that, South Africa really is this marvelous place that's held hostage by a really sinister regime.
And I remember back in 2018, when Trump, during his previous term, spoke about, or expressed some concern about what's happening in South Africa, the South African government famously said, we are now going to go to America to tell the truth about South Africa. And this truth-telling was Ramaphosa speaking at Bloomberg saying there are no farm killings, there are no land invasions in South Africa. So what's really strange about that is it would have been a better argument to say something like, yes, this is a problem, but remember this and this. But just going and flat out denying the existence of the problem. You can't deny the existence of the problem. You're not going to go far. So it's very unwise. And I've heard many similar stories from other countries, people working for the government or politicians saying we had some interaction with the South African government and it was really strange how they conducted themselves, how unprofessional they were, how remorseful they were or resentful, at least, and how they've gone out of their way to destroy diplomatic relations, and now they seem surprised that this hasn't worked out very well for them. The way you mentioned this, the speeches against America, the remarks made at the United Nations, the voting patterns, and so forth. And now what's really concerning is how people are trying to flip the script by saying, oh, no, this is because of misinformation, or it's because of those white people. They should be blamed for this. It's concerning, but I think I don't see how this could have played out any differently. Eventually, this bubble would have bursted, and that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy thing to sort of blame AfriForum Solidarity for basically ringing the alarm bell and saying, hey, there's some serious problems here. I mean, firstly, if they were lying, it wouldn't be very hard to do a little bit of fact-checking. I mean, it's the American government, right?
Yes.
I think they can go and find out what your laws actually say. I think they can go and read your news reports. I think they can watch the videos that the ANC and the FF are putting out there. If the claims being made were utterly false, it would come out very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And obviously the claims that are made are very easy to verify. What's interesting, as you say, on farm murders, the way that it's debunked is to say there are allegations of a white genocide and there's no white genocide. And so you create this false straw man and say nothing to see here. And that's just a horrendous thing when you have a genuine problem of brutal, torturous farm attacks with quite a simple solution to my mind,
yes,
which is that you make it a priority crime, you bring back something like the commando system, and you then say we care about protecting all of our citizens. It's not that hard, actually.
Yes.
It's sort of like, as you say, with rhino poaching or copper cable theft, you say there's a reason to make it a priority crime. Food security matters. You've got a very small number of farmers in South Africa. It's an important industry worth protecting. Why not? You've also got, farm laborers who get held up during these farm attacks. Even if you're a race nationalist, you say, like, I don't care about white farmers. I do care about their laborers, and I care about their prosperity and their jobs and them not being attacked. Why not do that? It's not that difficult.
It's supposed to be very simple and easy.
Yeah.
We're in a strange situation now in South Africa. There's all these concerns, being expressed in the direction that we're headed. And I think maybe this is a point where we can close off with hearing your views on the extent to which you are optimistic or pessimistic about the direction things are going. Because we've heard a lot of pessimism, but we also hear some optimism from some people. So what makes you pessimistic and what makes you optimistic about where we are and where we could be headed?
Well, I think we are at a very interesting crossroads. And there's a sense in which I think South Africans are used to being on a precipice. You have this continual threat of things could get very bad very quickly. What we've tended to have is a sort of slow decay, the frog sort of slowly getting boiled. But things can unravel very quickly. If you're a student of history, you sort of see how radical movements can suddenly seize power and, really obliterate your economy overnight. When Allende took over in Chile, you had massive food shortages, people queuing outside. He then had a big counter reaction with the government coming in and, acting in a totalitarian way and like setting up camps and killing people and disappearing people. So things can happen very quickly. I suppose one of the things that gives me hope about South Africa is that we do have an incredibly strong civil society. You've got NGOs who identify the problems quite well, that some of them at least are reasonably well funded, that they are good at litigating, and that our private sector works incredibly well. I mean, if I think about my friends from America or Canada or the UK who moved out there and come back to South Africa for healthcare, that tells you something interesting. So they say, well, in South Africa, I can get it affordably, quickly. I can actually go and get an appointment like immediately. Whereas in Canada, you might wait 3 months. In the UK, it's like a year and a half or some things. Same in the States. And it's a good product. You have incredibly talented South African doctors. And that story you sort of see throughout the private sector. So there is this private backbone. You have communities that are, good at championing their interests. And what you just have is this parasitic state that, undermines a lot of these structures and tries to sort of drain as much blood out of them as possible. And so I suppose the question is how long the good guys can sort of last, and whether the good guys are able to take this opportunity now. So it's interesting that the South African government hasn't sent out a delegation to America yet, but civil society groups have gone and the DA has gone. And we will have an ambassador from America coming out at some point, and I think there will be a sense of saying South Africa's got to make a choice. Even someone like Ibrahim Rasool said, well, China is our biggest trading partner, America is our second biggest, but we send minerals off to China and manufactured goods off to America. So you can't just have a substitution. America is the greatest consumer in the world. You're going to devastate that industry. And so the question is how much pain the ANC is willing to inflict on the South African public for its own personal enrichment project. And maybe that's why things like targeted sanctions might sort of flip that. I think there are some voices, maybe not nearly enough, in the ANC who recognize that going down this path is not in their narrow interest, and I think that's the only interest that those guys actually care about. The idea that they're there as the vanguard, for all South Africans or for black people or for the poor, forget about that. Like, that's belied by their actions. And even News 24 sort of accept that, that you're dealing with a sort of like cancerous body that is, there for extraction purposes and not for any greater good.
Yeah. Well, Mark Oppenheimer, thank you very much. It's good to have you on, and I'm sure we'll have you back.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you. If you support this initiative and you want to contribute to the work that we are doing, I want to encourage you to click on the link in the description and to sign up as a contributor.